The first one is kind of more on just sort of a new emphasis on, or a new sort of interest in spiritual disciplines, like a renewed interest in that. And then this is modern worship. But this one, number 15, I think you guys have had a recent survey on just sort of the growing interest in the Reformed movement. And now Barna's kind of come and said, no, there isn't a new interest in the Reformed movement. So I'm wondering what you think.
We took a ton of hit for that.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting to me because you know, data is what data is. It's tough because basically the way we measure that was whether pastors were identifying as Reformed, and you know, whether that label was more likely to be used today than 10 years ago, and it just was the same. And so I think our conclusion wasn't that there was nothing happening in the Reform movement or that people weren't interested, just that it wasn't showing up through that indicator. Those churches weren't any larger. They weren't necessarily a greater proportion of Southern Baptist churches. And so, you know, based on that very limited lens on faith, we didn't see a lot of growth there. Now, there could be, you know, in terms of publishing and some other things, you know, some real interest in that.
Or among more lay people or outside of pastoral circles.
Well, the other thing to remember too is that sometimes there's a rebirth and a resurgence, you know, as that term gets used with this movement. There's new attention paid to it because there aren't necessarily fewer people who are, you know, fans of baseball today than there were, you know, a generation ago. So people are surprised when baseball fans come out of the woodwork to go to the games, but it just feels like you know, it may feel like you know, a sport from a different era, and I think that's part of what's happening is when you see any attention on some of these things. One of the things we've noticed in our research that I think is true of this is that just because you see it happening in a corner of culture doesn't mean it's a dominant new expression. And I don't, again, mean this as a point of skepticism about the Reform movement. I'm just saying, in general, just because you see some successful books or projects in a particular area may just be true of that particular group of people who are rediscovering it, and it may not be bubbling outside of the typical boundaries. And that's a question I think that any group ought to pay attention to.
Right. When I think about the Reform movement, and when I was reading your guys' survey and stuff, I wonder how much of it is sort of formalized, and how much of it is just sort of people's thinking and the way that they, like, maybe they don't even know that what they're thinking right now about God's will is a Reformed thought. But maybe it's just sort of what's being preached from the pulpit, but not necessarily ever defined as Reformed.
Yeah, that's entirely possible, and I think it's entirely possible that as a response to our culture's anything goes, and you know, let's make it hipster and cool, that as the church says, no, let's dig deeper, that becomes a normative experience across a lot of areas. So I mean, even you could say like the charismatic movement and the Jesus movement, you know, 40 years ago, maybe didn't influence the entire church, but it did. And so I think you probably could say a lot of things very similarly today about the Reform movement, that, you know, it may not have you know, bubbled out of its container, you know, in terms of the percentage of pastors who identify as Reformed, but is maybe bubbling out in other ways. And that's one of the things we tried to admit, by the way, in our research, was we're just, you know, we've spent about $10,000 of our own money to try to research that, and you know, if people want to spend more to do it, do a different study or a deeper one, hey, let's go for it. But these studies cost a lot of money. They're, you know, they're hard to do. They're not easy. We are trying to get the best possible samples of pastors, and you know, through the very best lens that we have, and that's the conversation we're trying to help spark.
There's actually kind of a couple of them that talk about this in here, but between the Reformed and then, you know, kind of interesting aspects of charismatic being sort of accepted more broadly in churches, to people starting to kind of, I don't know, work in more creeds and liturgy and more ancient traditions and even icons into churches. It seems like particularly with younger non-denominational churches, it's becoming kind of like this ecclesial buffet where it's just like, we'll do a little bit of this, and yeah, sure, we'll do infant baptisms, but we can just dedicate your baby to if you want, and whatever you think about communion, and we'll do creeds once in a while, but we'll also just like freeform pray or whatever. So it kind of seems like this very interesting, like anything goes thing. Have you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's the fellow who wrote and named Generation X in a book, Generation X: Tales from Accelerated Culture, has this book, Life After God, and towards the end of that book, again, life after God, but then towards the end of the book, he basically says that after a generation searches, they end up back at God. And I think there certainly is a lot of just that with our generation, where many pastors are this idea, that you have here is that old is the new, that people are looking for ancient expressions and liturgical expressions. They're looking for things of depth and character and things that matter. Part of that's the economy, and again, this purification process that's taken place. I think part of it, and this is where I think with the reform question, I think we really have an honest sort of question and debate about whether is it that the reform movement is asking us to look at some of these older traditions, or is it just that all of today's Christians are more interested in things that matter and are asking themselves about liturgical and ancient questions. So in the Reformed tradition, the expression is that we're interested in Mark Driscoll and Matt Chandler and books about vocation. And in other traditions, it's different. By the way, I actually come personally from a Reformed tradition, so it's one of these things where, it's like I wasn't excited to write that there isn't a lot of growth there, but it's one of those things that you have to report the data as you see it. But I think that's certainly a place where you see this great opportunity that the church could reconnect with some history. We just interviewed a young woman who had told us that her faith was saved when she realized that church history went further than 500 years back, and that the opportunities to understand monasticism and to understand some of the desert fathers and other things had given her a new lens, a new window on faith that allowed her soul to awaken. And again, those are, I think, those are kinds of things that are happening in so many different traditions that it's a real positive. Can the church make the best of that opportunity?
I feel like that's such a weird and interesting phenomenon. All these people who are saying, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, but then also an uptick in sort of high church liturgical traditions where young people are sort of flocking to those ancient traditions, which would seem very religious in a way. So.
Well, and this goes back to the question we were talking about earlier, is Barna, really promoting people who are spiritual but not religious. And you think about the words that Jesus uses to the woman at the well, where there's a time coming where people will worship in spirit and truth, and that's the kind of people that God's looking for. And there are two kind of competing narratives in our research, just of what we're finding. One is that Americans are deeply spiritual people, and the other is that Americans are deeply superficial people, and that they're more religious on the outside, and that church caters to that, because if we can get people in the building and have them attend, then we feel like we've kind of done something good. And so I think that's the challenge that we have. To whatever extent that the church capitulates to superficiality and sort of capitulates to let's just get them in the building, we're intensely focused on trying to reform the church in that way. And then to whatever extent the church is cultivating those areas of deep faith, we're trying to promote that and shine a light on it.
One of the things that we talked about is a sort of, in the political section, young Christians really starting to sway more towards the independent. They're not Democrats, they're not Republicans. And I feel like that's something that we say, and is it true? Do you see that? Or are people really, most Christians are still Republican?
Yeah, I'm nodding my head, yes, they are. Again, it depends a little bit on how you define what a Christian or what a young Christian looks like.
Sure.
And denominationally, the more you're within, traditionally theologically conservative circles, the more political conservatism, rightly or wrongly, I'm not making a good or value judgment on this, but the more theologically conservative the person, age-wise, makes much less difference than their level of theological sort of ideology or their theology. And so certainly you see with mainline and some Catholic young people, a more progressive view towards some of this stuff, and there are, I think, questions about even among some of the most conservative Christians about the methods and means that we would carry this out. But there still tends to be a fair amount of conservatism, political conservatism as well.
Right.
But it just depends on where you look and how you look for it.
Yeah. I think the other one that is really fascinating to me is sort of the number 25, gay marriage gets confusing when your best friend is gay. And just sort of a lot of conversation, I think, among young Christians about what is the church going to do with sort of this homosexuality issue and gay marriage and civil unions and all of that. And, at least some of the research that we pointed to is saying that younger Christians are a little confused about what to do. They have more gay friends. They support civil unions, but not necessarily marriage. So it's kind of maybe just not sure what to do.
I think it's the single most important social issue that will define how the church sort of lives in this tension of the future, where, for those of us with a theologically conservative perspective, it's to reconcile our trust in what Scripture says about sexuality to just the way you guys framed it so beautifully. Gay marriage gets confusing when your best friend is gay, and the social implications for how do we think about our role as citizens in a government? How do we think about our role as citizens, even more importantly, as a kingdom that's here and not yet? And it's a very difficult issue, especially because there are many different perspectives on this, that a lot of Christians are really rethinking whether the ethic of, sort of describing homosexuality as not consistent, as wrong, as not consistent with Christian discipleship is even correct. And so I think, and there's a large enough number of voices. I think you guys, depicted it accurately. Like, abortion is a much clearer point of view. And this, by the way, is where, getting on the politics question, there is a lot of movement between younger and older Christians. So they may not be as likely to identify as independent or Democrat, but on many of these issues, they are just looking at a fuller range of questions, like how do we live effectively as Christians if we vote for Proposition 8 in California? What does that say about our willingness to, love those people that we say we love? Does the government need to define marriage in the same way? And I mean, I have my own opinions on those things, but those are questions I think that younger Christians are really wrestling with. Yeah,
and it's certainly something that, in your book, that non-Christians, that's one of their big, negative perceptions of the church.
It's the single biggest negative perception of the church, and there's so many stories that you hear from young Christians in trying to have the right response to it.
Right.
And it's going to
really
be a
tough.
really, really challenging one
really is.
over the next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah.